sorry. Is that your core criterion of what it means to be a person? Therefore, that's why we do the survey first, so that you have a vantage point to be able to select, at least for yourself, what you consider to be the most important criterion. So, where have we got to? How do I manipulate this? I'm used to apples. Let me go down. Is there a mouse that goes with this? I want to put it on full screen. Oh, okay. Just to recap where we got to, and I think it's reasonably plain, hopefully, so far. We started out with biological understandings of the human. We noted that you could divide up the criteria into three categories. One having to do with the interior life of the person, the concept of the mind, the concept of self, the concept of consciousness and self-consciousness, and then a cognitive ability to process the world around you, to assist you in coming to preferences and how you interact with the world, because that's all choices are, right? And so forth. And then the exterior ones, which are not really exterior, it's just the self looking outward. It's not as if it's located outside the person. It has to do with a capacity for empathy, a capacity for entering into relationships and benefiting from relationships, and a capacity to, as it were, be known and be knowable to third parties, particularly through communication, with the caveat that formal communication is only one form of communication. There are many forms of human communication, which is something that I think a lot of lawyers and government people don't understand when it comes to issues like guardianship and legal capacity. So the biologists are relatively agnostic as to which one of these criteria is it, the essence. Whereas when we come to the more normative area of controversy and discussion, it seems to be the case that the center of gravity within mainstream ethics is that the thing that most distinguishes us from other entities on the globe is our ability to think, our cognitive capacities, to make sense of the world, to think for ourselves, not to think as part of a block, but to think individually, and so forth. That's kind of an interesting twist. You got to ask yourself the historical question, where did that come from? It didn't just come from abstract debate within ethics. It probably has roots in other historical reasons, other historical causes. If you go back to world cultures, and I mentioned the book from Oxford about world cultures, you'll see that they have vastly different views about what is the nature of man and woman. I include woman in there. If you go back to, for example, Confucian culture on the essence of what it means to be a person, it's radically different to the debate within ethics and so forth. So, in any event, before you're admitted into the moral community and afforded certain basic rights, you have to be, quote unquote, a morally considerable person. And this is the debate, or have full moral status, which is another way of saying the same thing. Once you're in, you win. If you're not in, you don't stand to win, although there may be secondary reasons why we should nevertheless treat you, maybe not as fairly as a person, but at least somewhat fairly. For example, humane killing of animals. Well, the animal is still killed, right? Regardless of whether it's humane or not. And then once you're in, you're a free moral agent. You have the right to do wrong. You have the right to do things that we might not agree with, but hey, it's your life. Go ahead and do it if you want. And we give you this space, we give you this privilege because we think you're a responsible agent, because we trust you to get it right most of the time. And if you don't, you'll pay for it. Hey, that's life. And we trust that you're so free a moral agent that you're going to be free from undue influence from others, from coercion from others, that when you say you want to do something, it's you talking. There's a self lurking behind that mask, right? It's not your teacher talking. It's not your parents talking. It's not your husband or wife talking, although mostly it is with me. It's you, and we can trust that we're actually dealing with you, okay? Just so happens to be the case that this has pretty much for the last 300 years operationalized very much a Kantian view of the atomistic self, the atomistic individual rationally unpacking the world, rationally choosing their own ends, and rationally pursuing those ends. Whether or not there was an accident of history is an interesting question. Whether there could have been another rationalization for our fixation on cognition is an open question, or whether cognition itself might not have been the essential criteria is an open question. There's a very, very interesting book on, too many bloody interesting books, right? It's called The Renaissance Conception of Man, right? And look at, you won't find it, maybe you'll find it in secondhand on Amazon or something like that. But when you look at it, you'll see that the Renaissance conception of the person is radically different to the Enlightenment conception of the person. The Renaissance conception of the person is summed up in a guy called Pico. It's not pixels on your computer. The guy's name is Pico, P-I-C-O. And maybe if you even just Google Pico and look at his philosophy, you'll see that the Enlightenment had a certain air of false necessity about it, that it wasn't absolutely necessary that Western, which means global culture by now, wouldn't be locked into this Kantian perspective. In any event, the law just puts a lid on this. The law seals it into place by essentially erecting a test of who a person is in law. And who a person is in law is somebody who can rationally make decisions for themselves. You saw that fair and square in the English Mental Capacity Act, right? So the issue of whether you could function as a person turned exclusively on the issue, did you have the mental, meaning, cognitive capacity to navigate your way through the life world, okay? And that's one of the things that the UN Disability Treaty breaks. It says there is no connection between cognitive incapacity and legal capacity. What it's actually really saying is that personhood does not depend on cognitive ability. One thing that people who advocate for the convention haven't said is what their criteria of personhood is, or whether they have any. And remember, one of the third category within biology was just sentience, just being, just experiencing, just, for example, experiencing a pinprick in your hand. That's enough. That makes you not only a human, but also a person in law. But they've never actually said that, so it'll be interesting for you to question Anita as to the basis of her conception of personhood when it comes to Article 12 of the Convention. So we test for personhood in law. And if you fall short of that test, you are probably morally inconsiderable, and you are also not a person in law. That doesn't mean it's the end of the story. There might be some consolation prizes for you, like best interests and guardianship or something like that. But you're not acknowledged as a free moral agent, and you're not giving that space in the legal system. Pretty much all our legal systems. That's the fascinating thing. How Immanuel Kant in Germany got on cheap airlines and traveled the world, and you'll now see emanations of him in Beijing, in Africa, in Europe. The Chinese Civil Code operationalizes this fixation on cognition. It isn't just the German Civil Code or the English common law and statute law and so forth. Right. Where we got to the last day was debates about genetics and debates about the traits that are stamped in all of us that actually come from our common genetic pool and our genetic heritage. And they're not very nice traits, as you've seen. And they're peculiar to a particular age where if you didn't fight, you died. It wasn't as if you had a choice to flee. You either had to fight or die, okay? So all of these predispositions like aggression, like a negative attitude toward the other, like extreme possessive territoriality. This is my country, how dare you come in here, and so on and so forth. It isn't just particular politicians who say this. This is embedded in the human condition, right? That's not to justify it in politicians, but it's to explain it at a certain level. And this could be taken as highly corrosive of the very existence and integrity of the field of ethics, because ethics purports to be, stroke pretends to be, abstract, impartial, objective, derived neutrally from principles, let's say, negotiated through the social contract. Rubbish, the genetic scientists could say. It's actually just a roundabout elliptical way of expressing some of the desiderata of survival and propagation of the genes from one generation to the next. I haven't seen sociobiology explanation of religion, which would be quite interesting, but in any event, you can extrapolate it from it, a very corrosive critique of the whole field of ethics. And indeed, some people do, not many people, but some people extrapolate from it a denial of the very existence of a self. Bruce Hood doesn't quite come to that point. He says that the self is a contrivance of many independent features in, for want of a better expression, our mind, although it's curious how they are not unanimous as to what the mind is, even within the hard sciences. And that somehow or other, some form of control, perhaps it comes from an autobiographical self-understanding that arises from your own experiences. Maybe you grew up in Delhi, or you grew up in Bangalore or Hyderabad and so forth. That kind of is the cockpit, so to speak. There is no objective reality. It's something that's simply contrived as an intermix of different variables. Of course, if you believe it, it's true, but it itself has no objective grounding. The analogy that I think of is, you know, this diagnostic manual that the World Health Organization has for illnesses, particularly mental illnesses. They recently came out and said, oh, by the way, 85% of the illnesses that are labeled and categorized in the WHO diagnostic manual have no organic grounding whatsoever, okay? So they're in a sense kind of like social constructions, and the guys who put it together admit they're social constructions. Reputedly, the disease of panic attack never existed until a drug company wanted a market that would match a drug that it had, okay? So if you have panic attack, don't worry, you don't have panic attack. You might think you do. Right, so now we're in the kind of a different zone, which is not so much that the self doesn't exist. It exists all right, but its existence is more social than individual. Of course, it has to be experienced individually, right? But in its essence, it's a social contrivance. It's not something that is utterly atomistic to you, okay? So I gave you the recent World Bank report, 2015. Boy, economics is interesting. Going through high school, I didn't think that, but actually reading the World Report, fascinating. As well as Laura Davies' article. Now, if you couldn't find it, that's my fault, because I sent you on a wild goose chase. I said it was in Hein Online. It's not in Hein Online. It's in a very interesting journal called Hypatia. Don't ask me what Hypatia means. It's a feminist journal. And actually, interestingly, they have periodic calls for papers for symposium issues. I can't quite remember what the one is next year. See, I do need to be upgraded. In any event, she wrote in the special issue in the fall of 2015, happened to be on disability, but what she does is she picks up on relational understandings of autonomy. That's the phrase that's actually used. And I'll get to that momentarily. I do have one or two exercises for you, just to try and draw this out. So let's just go through it very briefly and set it up. Okay, So, so what you're looking at in economics, which is the last bastion of rationality and self-interested, calculated action on the part of rational economic man, it's changing. The field is changing. And there's now a subfield which is threatening to become the field, which is called behavioral economics. And that's really what the World Bank report deals with and connects it with debates about development. There was an amazing report, 10, 12 years ago in the UK about how their development dollars or pounds, not euros, definitely not euros, in one particular African country produced no tangible result. The answer, and they did an evaluation, the answer was, although they'd poured the resources in, they hadn't done anything to change the policy narrative, the very narrow policy narrative of the policy gatekeepers, the senior civil servants. And if you don't change that, nothing happens, because they're the gatekeepers to the entire system. Lesson learned, we have to put as much effort into actually reframing the high ground and nudging the policymakers to that high ground before you can actually embed a sustainable process of change. So the turn towards shared personhood, intersubjectivity, which just means my human subject interrelates with your human subject. There's nothing highfalutin about that, okay? And relational autonomy in feminism is not new. It goes back quite a while. But it's been applied now in different domains. I guess one of the people who's really founding ladies of this is Jennifer Nadelsky, whom you probably heard, because she's a prolific writer and very, very clear writer. So I just put these two together, not necessarily related. It's just I wanted to cover two in one class to try and expose to you how the standard account of who a person is no longer standard in these different disciplines. Now the law is always late to catch up, but sooner or later it catches up because of the sheer pressure of time and so forth. I also told you previously the law has its own interests. It's not just a pale shadow of how all of these different disciplines are intersecting and arriving at a consensus which was frozen in time 300 years ago. It too has a reason for insisting on cognition as being the essence of humanity, and that has everything to do with the reliance interest of third parties in increasingly commercial societies, which of course is what the Enlightenment eventually led to throughout Europe. It wasn't just using an ethic of justification to give power back to people over their own lives. It was an ethic of justification to hold to account the inefficient economic model of feudalism and wipe it away and replace it with a very simple public-private distinction. And of course, the masterless man who wanders abroad seeking his own ends like the Kantian hero then becomes not just an honorary individual but a possessive individual. That is the key to legal history over the last 200 or 300 years. Okay, in any event, you can tell legal history is one of my favorite subjects. The World Bank report, 2015, fascinating report. It's a long report. I only gave you the introduction. I gave you the audio file. I'm not sure I gave you the right link to the audio file, but at least you could read the summary, okay? Hopefully some of you have gotten to that. The contrast is with classical economics. There's information. Actually, in the perfect market, there's perfect information. I don't know about you, but I can't handle even a minor amount of information, let alone perfect information. It goes through a process within the individual of thinking rationally, calculating your own self-interests, and then producing an outcome, in other words, a preference or a decision to behave one way or behave another way. And all of those preferences put together constitute the magic hand of the market. So trust the market to work itself pure, and it works itself pure when there is perfect information, obviously when there's competition, and when individuals are positioned to make their own decisions accordingly. So the World Bank reports pretty much says rubbish. That's actually not the way. Micro decisions are made on the part of individuals, or group decisions are made, or larger decisions are made in society. That's quite fascinating and very challenging to the Kantian view of the high cognitively functioning rational individual navigating the life world. The World Bank report says humans are not calculating automatons. I'm not sure Kant ever said they were calculating automatons, but that's what they say. They're more like malleable emotional actors. That most of the time we're not, sitting back and doing the calculations and making our decisions accordingly. We emote our way toward a decision. And remember, the clinical psychologists say rationality and emotion, they're not two different things. They're actually fused together. That's what the clinical psychologists are saying now. So even from that very early opening sentence, you can see that the World Bank is going to have a very different view to classical economics. It's not trying to displace classical economics, but it's trying to give a context and a background to it so that governments better understand why their development programs haven't worked in the past and how they might be reconfigured to work better into the future, or to use that famous term, nudged to actually produce socially beneficial behavior. So, humans think and act. They largely think automatically and seldom rationally. This kind of is getting back to the sociobiologists and the geneticists. It's that primitive part of our brain that's telling us, oh no, push back on this guy, or I don't know this person, so I'm not going to invest in developing the relationship to find out enough about whether we should interact, and so on and so forth, etc., etc. And of course, when you're driving, it's the primitive part of the brain that's activated and not the cognitive side of the brain. We think socially and we think using mental models. Let me just unpack those for a moment. But note the World Bank is not saying we think primarily rationally using our high cognitive functions, okay? Thinking automatically. By the way, this book is amazing if you ever get a chance of reading it. It's Daniel Kahneman. He was the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow, which draws out these distinctions about the primitive part of the brain that does most of the deciding, right? And the higher cognitive functions that are kept in reserve for certain issues, kicked into in certain issues and occasions, but is not primary. What's primary is the more basic part of your mental makeup. So psychologists have long distinguished two kinds of processes that people use when thinking: those that are fast, automatic, effortless, and associated. I like the effortless part, right? You don't have to think too much about it. You can rely on your impulses and instincts as much as you can rely on the information and how you process the information. And then those that are slow, deliberative, effortful, and reflective. There's some letters left out of here. So you can think of a judge doing this, right? Hopefully, hopefully. This is judge-like behavior, but it's not normal behavior in the rest of society. I was telling somebody earlier on that I'm telling you too many good books to read. One is by Jerome Frank. Have people heard of Jerome Frank here? He was a guy in the 1930s, one of the founders of the legal realist movement in the US, who was told that he needed to go to psychotherapy for a whole year once a day. Because psychotherapy was the in thing then. And he was going to his company's offices in New York. He was based in Chicago for 6 months. So he actually went to psychotherapy twice a day. And at the end of it, he was no more improved than he was at the beginning. But he said, oh my God, I can't let this go. I have to produce something out of it. So he wrote a famous book, which is like the first application of psychiatry to law, called Law and the Modern Mind. It's probably on Google Books. It's probably out there electronically now, but if it isn't, you'll find a cheap copy secondhand on Amazon. And his basic thesis, picking up on psychotherapy as it was at that point in time, was that judges are humans, humans rationalize decisions, therefore all decisions are basically rationalizations. You cannot trust a legal opinion. It's probably concealing the true grounds of decision. And controversially, there is no law until you go into the courtroom. That is to say, the law is what the judge does. There is no abstract principles of law. So very interesting kind of application of this. Very, very, very well written and provocative book. I'd encourage anybody to read it. So, so here's the distinction, therefore, between the two different processes, noting that probably 99% of the time it's the automatic process that kicks in, not the higher deliberative process. So it's okay to be automatic. When you're appointed to the bench, we expect something higher from you, okay? Or maybe not, as the case may be. Automatic thinking. Here's a machine to mimic automatic thinking. The automatic system influences most of our judgments and decisions, often in powerful and even decisive ways. Code word for we're not even self-conscious or aware that that's actually happening. Most people, most of the time, are not aware of many of the influences on their decisions. People who engage in automatic thinking can make what they themselves believe to be mistakes. That is, people can look back on the choices they made while engaging in automatic thinking and wish they had decided otherwise. So we all have regrets about buying certain DVDs or CDs or whatnot, or motorbikes or cars. But probably we don't change our behavior. If you're like me, I make certain mistakes all the time. I never change. I don't learn from those mistakes. See, one of the expectations that the exaggerated liberal conception of the person makes on, let's say, people with intellectual disabilities is, of course the moral agent can do wrong and make mistakes, but at least they can learn from them, right? Whereas people with intellectual disabilities can't learn from them. Well, guess what? Most people don't learn from them anyhow. At least I've never learned from mine, which are mainly financial, by the way. And then the automatic thinking is combined with more social thinking. So we're social animals. We're influenced by others. We like to go with the group. There's another good book on groupthink by Cass Sunstein. It's just out about a year. Extremely interesting in terms of corporate diversity and how you have alternative views on corporate boards. And interestingly, in that book, Cass Sunstein goes on to defend women as board members and mandatory quotas for women as board members in large multinational corporations. Okay, individuals are social animals who are influenced by social preferences, networks, identities, and social norms. They care about those around them are doing and how they fit into their groups. So it's not so much you want to make a decision for me, like this moral agent wandering abroad. It's more that your decision is going to be skewed so that you get kudos and feedback and positive feedback from the social group in which you're attached. And interestingly, if you're with one social group in the morning and a different social group in the afternoon, probably your preferences change at least slightly, unless you're an unusually strong person. Many people have strong social preferences for fairness. Oh, this is very interesting, that in our society, collectively speaking, we may have good impulses, like towards social fairness, or we may have bad influences, like toward discrimination and exclusion. Of course, the social biologists would say, that's not bad. That's actually good in terms of actually preserving the integrity of the gene pool, okay? So it's explicable at least by reference to sociobiology. What they're getting at, the World Bank people, is that these negative social cues are the real blockage to change real behavior on the ground. So if you want behavior to actually change, if you want people to drink less sugary drinks, and drink more healthy nutritional drinks and so forth, you've got to nudge that behavior. You've got to engage in intensive social marketing for the right kind of behavior. In other words, the state can intervene and bring about a shift in the social cues that in turn brings about the shift in individual behavior. I like it. It's interesting. It's innovative, but it does remind me a little bit of East Germany, and we'll come back to that momentarily. Remember, in East Germany, what they tried to do towards such kind of intentional intervention is manufacture socialist man, okay? To manufacture a certain kind of moral agent that would, of course, comply with the party's dictate and so on and so forth. So although you can see value in the observation, I think there are dangers as well in it. Here's the book by Taylor and Sunstein, just called Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. And Cass Sunstein was special advisor to the President, Barack Obama, on precisely this, and on regulatory change, to make sure that that regulatory change, or the regulations weren't just top-down commands anymore, which industry hates and has always hated, but it actually is more focused on nudge factors to help bring about more positive behavioral change. How that worked out, I can't tell you, but that at least was his task in the White House for the last few years. So human sociality, I can't quite pronounce that word, implies that behavior is also influenced by social expectations, recognitions, patterns of cooperation, care of the in-group members, not the out-group members, the in-group members, and social norms. And the design of public institutions send their own cues as well. Okay, so we think automatically. We don't primarily engage our cognitive capacities in deciding which class to go to or whether to go to class. It's more an impulse at the moment. And we're also social animals. We are motivated to behave and be seen to behave in a pattern of behavior that fits with the social groups, the social cues that are given to us, and we're heavily influenced by that. Although it goes in waves and in circles depending on which group you happen to belong to at a particular point in time. I always tell students who are like 17, 18, 19, you're out of a family for probably at most 5 to 10 years of your life. You grow up in a family, you have that brief moment of bliss when you're single, and then you're back into a family again. So your social circles, you're navigating different social circles, and they evolve all of the time. Okay, and then it's totally different when your kids are gone away, I can tell you. So what about these thinking through mental apparatuses? Very simple. It's the idea that our cognitive capacities, no matter how amazing they are relative to other species, they're not like Cray supercomputers. And even if they were, we don't engage them probably as much as we should. I think the statistics show that we only engage our cognitive capacities 30% of the time. So there's a lot of underused capacity in the CPU up there, okay? And we don't like processing large amounts of information. We can do it. Mathematicians can do it. Accountants can do it. Hopefully lawyers can do it. But most people don't, right? So if you say to somebody, I'm going to Switzerland for the year, you'll automatically come up with a very simple kind of narrative such as, wow, nice mountains, nice food, nice people, or boring, I wouldn't want to go there, or something like that. And we don't make judgments about other people after agonizing, after hearing their autobiographical story, after having a friendly interview. We make snap decisions on other people, either to put a fence up or to create a pathway, broad or narrow, on certain conditions or not. So that's what they mean by mental apparatuses, mental pictures, mental windows through which we apprehend the world. So obviously, if you frame that window widely, you expand the range of options that the person might engage in seriously. If it's a very narrow window, then of course the individual will perhaps pursue a very narrow course of action and so forth. So psychological and anthropological research suggests that, oh, this is very interesting, the impact of poverty on these very narrow windows. That they generate a mental model through which the poor see themselves and their opportunities. It can dull their capacity to imagine a better life. So that is one of the really interesting findings in the World Bank report, that poverty becomes a self-perpetuating thing partly because we haven't, as it were, expanded the horizons of the people who are actually experiencing the poverty themselves. So they typically have a very poor view of their own latent capacities, even though talent is statistically evenly spread in every society. And that, of course, means they're their own worst enemy, but it also means that from a development point of view, what we have to be doing is nudging them to raise their expectations. And once that happens, you're on a virtuous cycle toward something much better and so forth. So the rest of the World Bank report is really about the implications of thinking automatically, thinking socially, and thinking through mental apparatuses for development aid policies and how that they should be reconfigured. There is a chapter later on that summarizes the neuroscience, that summarizes the cognitive science, and other literature as well, which you can read at your leisure. But that's the essence of what they're trying to get at. Laura Davies, and I apologize if you couldn't get at the paper because it was in a specialized journal, Hypatia, which is, you'll be forgiven if you've never heard of it before. It's one of these rarefied journals which happens to have amazing papers in it. Laura Davies is a PhD student in the University of Sydney who is heavily engaged in theories of relational autonomy. And that kind of fits very much with the World Bank report, because they're emphasizing, cognition's not where it's at. Socially, yeah, you're very influenced by that. And mentally, the apparatuses you inherit from your background, from your culture, that's where it's at as well. So she's just kind of really super adding to that. The old idea from feminism that contrary to Kant, right, our autonomy is not experienced in isolation. It's experienced socially. Now be thinking ahead about what are the implications for this for super enhanced humans, or perhaps the merger of artificial intelligence with machines. Can those machines ever be sociable? Can they express empathy toward other machines? Hey, I'm running out of oil, will you put some oil in me, or something like that? So in any event, she picks up on this, which goes back to the 80s, the early 90s, feminists like Jennifer Nadelsky and others as well. And partly what they're doing is they're setting up this liberal spatial image and they're giving it a good kick, right? Because they see it as something that has held back women in society. Because there are alternative ways of imagining how a person exists in the world. And the Kantian image is not one that's well suited to the diversity of mankind in the world, women included. So they have the ideological bit within their teeth. They instinctively don't like where Kant is coming from. They instinctively don't like the idea that your personhood is poured into a body and is experienced utterly in isolation. One of the people that they love to hate is Patrick Henry. Anybody hear of Patrick Henry? He's one of the founding fathers in the United States. He was the guy who wrote the slogan, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? So one of the unique early libertarians in the American pantheon, okay? And he was all for this rugged individualism, the Minuteman standing ready to grab his musket and so forth. And what the feminists point out is Patrick Henry had 71 first cousins, right? He came from a very dense social network. He never had to worry about anything. He was always supported by that dense social network. And they say, isn't it typical that somebody who argues for Kant actually lives quite the contrary kind of life himself in his own life? So you get the sense that there is this ideological spat going on between the feminists and between the, for want of a better expression, the individualists, and particularly the possessive individualists. But there's also a valid point to be made apart from the polemical point, which is that we emanate from somewhere. None of us have emanated from nowhere. It's not as if there was a letter box out of which you suddenly emerged as a person, right? You emerged from parents, although that remains to be seen whether that's the future in biology. You probably grew up in a family life. If you're unlucky enough, you're an orphan or in an institution, which hopefully there are fewer and fewer today. By the way, there are 8 million children in institutions around the world today. And I'm ashamed to say 1.5 million of them are in Europe. I'm not sure what the situation is in India. It's a real advantage being a poor country because you can't afford the bloody institutions in the first place. So you should leapfrog ahead of that. So what they're really saying is that you not only have an autobiography, you have a biography that's shared with others around you, and your autobiography is a function of that. So you don't develop in splendid isolation, you develop in unison with others. That's essentially what they're saying. Put it another way, the others in your life are at one and the same time a support, source of encouragement, but also a threat, also a source of criticism, also a source of cajoling and so forth. So it isn't one or the other, it's both at the same time that are operative on the person. We do this to each other. And that's kind of like nature's way of forcing individuation. My father liked X, damn it, I'm going to like Y. My mother likes brown bread, oh damn it, I'm going to like sliced bread or whatnot. So there's a natural kind of evolutionary cycle or development going on there whereby you eventuate, and even when you are radically different to, let's say, your parents in your 20s or your 30s, you're still recognizably part of that social milieu out of which you emerged. So obviously what the feminists are trying to get at is the support paradigm. And what they're trying to reintegrate back into the liberal almost iconography is an ethic of caring, an ethic of reaching beyond oneself, and an ethic of actually empathizing toward others. And what they say, this is systematically what liberal theory and Kantian theory discounts. It discounts the very things we actually value the most, which are human love, human connectedness, and human empathy. You can see how useful that is in the context of disability, where you're trying to say, don't just eliminate that person's personhood. Why don't you give back to them what everybody else experienced, which is a dense social experience. In other words, no institutions, no segregation, no isolation, and try and ensure that their capacities are nurtured and nurtured better and watered in that kind of environment. And Anita will talk to you about this because this is what we call the notion of supportive decision making, which the UN Treaty valorizes and validates. So that's kind of what they're getting at. I won't bore you with the details. I'll give you a copy of the paper, which I think you're not able to find because the relevant journal is not probably accessible. But she goes on to look at other theorists who try and soften and modify the liberal conception of the person, individualist, assuming their own aims, and tries to say, well, okay, we might admit others into the picture provided they can meet certain procedural criteria for inclusion, but those procedural criteria of inclusion tend at the end to turn on cognitive capacity. So you're restating the grounds, or the contested grounds, of the liberal imagination and so forth. I'll leave you with that paper and let you draw from it what you want. Here's the spatial imagery at play, though, and I think it's really interesting to draw it out and be honest about it, right? And you won't find that in a lot of the literature, but I'm being honest about it, okay? We're talking about autonomy. Self, question mark, question mark, question mark. Nomi, which is Greek for law, self-government, okay? Autonomy. So you can either view the self here as the isolated, hermetically sealed automaton positing its own goals separately and without coercion or without interference from others, okay? That is the liberal dream. That's the Immanuel Kant dream, so to speak. And to many intents and purposes, that's the default embedded deep within our culture as well as in our legal culture, okay? Feminists come along and say, no, 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 no. The self is social. It's not primarily individual, and actually that's what the World Bank says when you read between the lines as well. The self is a product of social interaction and social construction, but still a free moral agent. Or at least some of them say that. So this is really a heuristic, a way of explaining where you came from. You now manifest as an individual self, although you had a history that goes back, and it's that history that helps explain your current orientation or your current disposition. But right now, taking a snapshot in this moment in time, you can make your own decisions separately from the social environment that surrounds you. And that's a way of making this social conception of the self fit with a liberal or a libertarian conception of the self. But the alternative is to say, no, we take it further than that. Not only is this a heuristic to explain where you came from, but it actually is vitally constitutive of who you are today. Okay? So my self, let's say you're part of my family, right? My self is to be found in you. And the word some feminists use is I am held by others. Okay? Trace elements of who I am, like in a hologram, are reflected in who they are, and vice versa. So we're mutual sources of each other's identity and each other's sense of self. Okay, push that a bit further. What if temporarily I am unknowable to you or unknowable to others? Does that mean that we go to you to try and find out who I really am? What my disposition is, whether I like cheese or whether I like butter or whatnot, and therefore allow you to, as it were, speak for me. Not as if you're actually speaking for me. We're all speaking for each other, actually. And take it even one stage further. Let's say our personhood is shared. We're following the feminist line, right? And I do something that's perhaps out of character. Maybe I blow all my money on drink. Maybe that's not so much out of character. Or I blow all my money at the racetrack, or whatever, okay? And you say, that's not you. We know who you are. You have deviated from our settled understanding of who you are as a person. Therefore, we think that your actions are not your actions, and therefore we can override your decision in that particular instance. So the 64 million rupee question is that what the feminists mean? Is that concept of shared personhood dangerous? it's a logical extrapolation of the theory of shared personhood, but do we need to imagine and then justify a theory that limits the conception of shared person? Okay? So I've contrived two exercises to try and bring this out. Again, we're going to have a government. Again, we're going to have civil society. Because there's no better way of actually coming to terms with this than to discuss it. Here it is. I'm imagining there's a shared personhood bill going through the Indian Parliament. Okay? The government is convinced by feminism. There you go. Isn't your government great? And is convinced by the World Bank report. Cognition's not where it's at. Okay? And introduces a bill to acknowledge shared personhood in India. Section 1 of the bill states, if a person cannot express their will, or if their will is plainly absurd, it's totally out of character, right, then application may be made to the district court by those close enough, my family here, to share the person's personhood to countermand their will on a theory that they know the person better than he or she knows themselves. That's a very muscular interpretation of shared personhood, and I want you to debate it. I want this side to be the government, building on feminism, building on the World Bank report, go feminism, right? And this side to be the opposition, perhaps influenced by civil society groups, human rights groups. You can be the Human Rights Commission, but this time I want an opinion from you, not about how they do, but your own autonomous, independent opinion. So huddle for 10, 15 minutes, and then let's debate this. Yeah. Over focus on group identity. So. I think we should not give them many arguments and talk about that afterwards, okay? So please formulate your position.